Danger zone. No, of course it's not. It's the inclusion zone. I'm James Hollis, a proud autistic voice in Britain's neurodivergent community and a diehard Top Gun fan, here with my dear friend
James Kenyon, your ADHD co-host, originally not from the northeast of England, but that's where I lived for several years. Welcome to the Neuropod, diving into neurodivergence and neuroinclusion, from autism to ADHD, with real stories and tips for parents, allies, or anyone tackling a neurotypical world.
Today we're broadcasting from Liverpool's vibrant Merseyside port town, a northern gem. In this second episode, I will be sharing my primary school adventures, from fitting to quirky obsessions, to spark neuroinclusion ideas for families everywhere.
Expect lively chats from the land of Liverpool, whether you're neurodivergent or supporting someone who is. If you like this podcast, subscribe on Spotify, the Neuropod, all one word, or catch exclusive clips on YouTube. Share our neurodivergent positivity, and let's hit the playground with Maverik. So, James, the first question I'd like to ask you in this second episode is that you said you were a slow learner at primary school and that was a trait that stayed with you. But can you share what that looked like to someone looking at you in the classroom back then?
So when it comes to how others viewed me, I think there was sympathy, mainly from the teachers, which was, I guess, a good thing. I think one of the main issues that I sort of encountered in that regard was when it came to my school friends. Some of them would sometimes make fun of me of the fact that I couldn't actually understand things that they understood or grasping concepts that they could grasp in as quick a time. So particularly when it came to, for example, times tables, I sort of got it, but I didn't get it as quickly as everybody else. It was as if everyone else was sort of like, well, this is something that you should just be able to absorb when it's just shown to you, and it's quite straightforward. But for me, it wasn't as straightforward as it may have seemed to some.
Yes, what you're saying really resonates with me there, actually, because I also remember my own struggles with things like times tables and grasping mathematical concepts, even at primary school. You're honest about not claiming to be a quick learner. And was there a particular task at school, maybe like a subject like we just talked about, maths, for example, or a particular project, where that slower pace was notable and had a sort of a negative impact on you from either your friends or your teachers?
So I think the one subject which was a real challenge to me was mathematics at the time. Languages came to me pretty quickly, actually. So I picked up on those quite quickly. But looking back, even though I had real issues with mathematics, I think it was less about the subject matter and the more the way I was taught it. And I think there's a wider debate in there, which no doubt we'll come on to at some point, about education in general in the UK, as far as how we teach young people, kids, not just those who are neurodivergent, but in general, because I was being taught during a time where it was very much a case of one size needs to fit all. But I think if I had been taught in a different way, which I then was when I went to secondary school, which is why my maths improved significantly, I think I wouldn't have had those challenges with the subject. So that was always a sort of thorn in my side, but I somehow muddled through that subject.
I mean, you said you were a slow learner at maths, but was there an area or subject at primary school where you surprised yourself by picking it up quickly, like intuitively, for example?
So as I briefly touched upon, languages was an area which I seemed to pick up relatively quickly. I think the reason for that was because vocabulary was quite straightforward, because that was a case of a pattern in the sense of this word means that, or that word means this. So I picked up vocab very quickly. But of course, looking at mathematics, it may seem to most of us like 2 times 2 equals 4, but it's not as straightforward as that. You have to understand, why does 2 times 2 equals 4? Whereas one word that we say in English is said like this in France, and you don't need to understand how you get there. It just is like that.
Yes, I'm afraid, I know this is terrible, but it does rather put me in mind of that scene from Blackadder 2, I think it was, where I think it's Baldric who's saying some beans and some beans equals some beans. And then Blackadder says, yes, Baldric, to you, the Renaissance was something that happened to other people, wasn't it? I don't know why I'm saying that, but anyway, that's completely irrelevant to our discussion. But that probably describes my own approach to maths as well, to be quite honest. It took a long time for me to grasp some of those concepts as well. When you nailed languages, for example, when you understood things, was that a confidence boost to you?
It was a confidence boost in the sense that it made up for any shortcomings I may have had in an area such as mathematics. Science, found that relatively straightforward, even though it took a bit of time to still grasp various concepts in those first 10 years of being at school, as in towards the age of 10.
Yeah, I think in our last episode, you touched on when you were young and sort of like 4 or 5, you were very interested in how things worked. And I wonder whether that was maybe why science appealed to you, whether that was why you enjoyed science, possibly.
I think there was definitely something to be said there, James. I think it was this idea of being curious, which is absolutely fundamental as far as science is concerned, because that's what it's all about. It's whenever you're sitting in a science lesson, one of the first things you do in terms of the practical side of things, you don't really do so much theory. You do sort of a lot of practical work, which is about experimenting. And experimenting is all about being curious. And I think when it's much more interactive in that regard, and I think this just goes for people in general, but certainly for those who are maybe neurodivergent, where our brains work in a very different way compared to the world of neurotypicals, I think there's something to be said about the practical side complementing the theoretical side, which therefore makes understanding of the subject matter that much more straightforward. And sort of if you come back to mathematics again, that's just pure theory. There's no really experimenting there, especially in those first during your school years. It's only later on, if you went to take maths to sort of university level, where you actually experiment with various theories and try and come up with your own mathematical models and designs.
So I wanted to ask you about how you were regarded by other students. Now, you said to me a little while ago that you found some of the other children quite unkind and almost bullying. I wonder whether you could maybe give an example as to when that happened and what your reaction was.
As I said, one of the examples I'll give is when I wasn't fitting in the sense as I wasn't getting mathematical concepts as quickly as everybody else seemed to grasping it. And I think that's the point when you're going from the ages of 5 to 10 years old. That's the moment I feel where, looking back, where kids start forming groups and where they're looking for reasons to fight to others, so to speak. And so if someone stands out in such a way as being, quote unquote, not normal or not the norm, that's when you start potentially suffering as a neurodivergent person, because you're not like everybody else. And that's when you get singled out, and where things can get particularly unpleasant, where it starts off with a bit of teasing to begin with, and maybe later it moves on to, if things get badly, then it spirals into bullying. So I think that was one instance. When it comes to my reaction, I think it was quite difficult to know how to react, because being neurodivergent, when sort of a particular type of empathy, in this case, cognitive empathy, does not come naturally, you're met with behavior which you're not used to, because I'd never been used to receiving such treatment from my peers, then it's very difficult to know how to react. And in some cases, I just didn't react at all.
Yeah. And can you share a particular moment when you were challenged or harassed by one of your classmates? Can you remember anything about what happened and how that played out?
Because I was interested in history and, of course, sketching, that made me stand out also as someone who had an obsessive interest that no one else had. How many 6, 7-year-olds have a real interest in sort of the history of, for example, the Second World War, of military history? Not many. So I was interested in this area because I was sketching it, and I had books on battles during the 20th century, and even prior to that, fellow school pupils who I knew, used to come up to me and say, "Do you like history?" And so I said, "Yes, obviously." And then they would ask me really specific questions to try and catch me out. So if I didn't know the answer to something, they would say, "Haha, you don't know anything about history," this sort of thing, which of course was a projection of their insecurities, because there were things about sort of history that they didn't know. So it was a case of, first of all, it was like me sort of saying, okay, I was not very strong at mathematics. Okay. So they didn't feel that they still sort of teased me in that regard when it came to maths. But on the other hand, they wanted to make sure that they could make me feel like I wasn't good at anything, because the sort of the area where I thought I did have an interest in, and maybe they felt threatened with, was history. And that's where they wanted to say, well, we've got to stamp on him in that regard as well.
Yeah. And that's the sort of thing, like at that point, you're feeling excluded from what other people are. You're feeling that was a sort of thing that you were just describing is when you're having that sort of teasing stroke bullying is when you've probably felt excluded. Am I right?
No, sure. And that was the first time I ever did feel any form of exclusion, which is, of course, not unusual for those who are neurodivergent. Not just autism. I think we should need to emphasize that. And, there are plenty of others out there who have other neurodivergent conditions, whether that be ADHD or even sort of dyslexia, who also feel a sense of isolation and exclusion because they're different. But that's the first time when I really it was a real shock to me to really get the sense of how unpleasant and even cruel other people could be. Because prior to that, I had only known sort of pupils or contemporaries of mine who treated me well, and I treated them well back. And this was the first time when I had actually been, whereas I was on the receiving end of hostility and unpleasantness.
Yeah, so how did other kids see you generally at school? I mean, were you sort of like the leader? Were you the joker, or were you sort of like something else in their eyes, do you think?
Well, I think when I had just joined school, there were instances that I remember where if we were playing games, I did lead. I did take the lead from time to time, especially when it came to if we were something to do with soldiers or something else, they always looked to me because I was the one who apparently at the time knew so much about it. But then over time, I think as we start developing as kids, over time, they look to others to be leaders, potentially also in areas where there are interests which are quote unquote cool. That's where neurodivergence, like with autism, come unstuck, is when young people start looking for the cool, quote unquote, cool kids. And they decide that maybe being interested in history and sketching those are not two hobbies or pastimes that you are associated with being quote unquote cool.
But did you find any friends at your school who these sort of things did resonate with, and what sort of impact did those sort of friendships have on you during your primary school days?
So I think I would count 3 in total who, towards the end of my time at primary school, that I would count as friends of mine. One of whom that was, looking back, was not really a friend. If I had been more mature, I would have recognized that was not really a friendship. It wasn't a very good friendship. You could even say it could have been a bit of a toxic friendship, which of course those exist unfortunately, and we've got to recognize them and then react accordingly. But at the time, I wasn't aware of that, I didn't recognize it as such. But there were 2 others who I did get on with, and who were, I guess you could say, they were quite, they were certainly not the cool kids. But that's fine, neither was I. I was not a cool kid either. And at the same time, we had some similar interests as well. So we spent a bit of time together, which was great. So I didn't feel that isolated. But of course, there's a lot of luck involved in that, because if those 2 hadn't been there, then I would have felt much more isolated as a result, because I knew I wasn't part of the larger groups of, say, 8 or 9 to up towards 10 people or kids who all spent time together playing sports, playing football and all of that, because I was spending time with two others. And I very much valued that. And I do look back to those times that those 2 and I had together, and they were actually quite fun times, I have to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of dive into your interest in history and the military and what have you. What was this about that brought you and your mates together? What was that? Did you playing soldiers or battles or anything, or was it more talking? Could you just expand on that?
Yeah, it was what you said. It was about, in those early years, it was about playing battles and things like that, being imaginary. And I think it was also a case of us trading information, I guess. I think this was also the dawn of the infamous computer game. So, I used to play computer games at home. And of course, they also were into computer games, so we had something to talk about. Because back then, you didn't have iPhones, you didn't have laptops. Everything was done at home, so the only thing you could do was talk about it at school. You couldn't actually play things together, play games together. You could only really talk about it at the time, and when you sort of met up after the weekend, for example. And so we bonded over that. And what was interesting was that when we used to play these games, I still took quite a central role in that. I would say I liked to stage things as if it was actually a sort of a military scenario playing out. Or if we were going to take away, move back the sort of military setup or the approach that I took, the militaristic approach I took, you could say it was a bit like a Shakespearean play where all of the different acts, so to speak, come after the other and they logically follow to a final conclusion.
Yeah, that sort of like speaks into a sort of like a love for planning quite detailed scenarios. And I'm wondering whether there was a need for you to plan those out so that things were predictable.
I think that I really did thrive on predictability at the time. One of the things that when it comes to autism, autistic spectrum conditions is there is an aspect of us which is quite sort of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So you have this sense of things in my room had to be in a certain place. And the reason that we do that is because it reduces the uncertainty in the world, which supports us when it comes to our anxiety. And so what you said about this planning out each act during our games together gave me also a sense of predictability, which also helped me make sense of the world in turn.
And did that actually, the predictability, and when you were engaging in these games and things at school, for example, was that in a way almost making things maybe consciously or unconsciously a bit less stressful and trying to make things a bit more enjoyable for you?
I think it certainly made things more enjoyable and we had great fun. But I think it was also, looking back on things, it was my way of dealing with uncertainty in the world. That's because of, I think maybe there was, looking back on the change that I witnessed in my school friends, who the majority of whom I could no longer count as friends, that made for me, that was a real sense of, oh, well, this world is really unpredictable. And especially when you feel like you've got so many friends and then suddenly actually they don't want to be your friends anymore. That's very stressful. It's quite, I would even say it's quite traumatizing for someone who is neurodivergent to go through that. And so it was nice to then be in a situation where you could actually have more certainty. And also you were the one in control of each scenario. There was nothing which was going to knock you sideways. It was all part of the plan. And then the conclusion, of course, to each game that we would play would always be in our favor. We never lost a battle. We were never captured by the enemy. A positive ending at the end of all of that.
You just said two words there, planning and control. And I wonder whether that was almost like a coping strategy in it unconsciously.
Certainly. And I think it's quite interesting the crossovers that you do have with the neurotypical world out there, because I think we all like to plan, that, as I said, neurotypicals included, and we always like to think we're in control, which is of course not the case in the world. I mean, I feel like over the years, one thing I've learned is that most of the things in our life we're not able to control. Okay, there's only a small percentage. I would even say like 10% of the things in our life we can actually control. The rest is out of our control. We all have various coping mechanisms, and those who are neurodivergent are no different in that regard.
No, absolutely. I think that's an element that has come through very strongly in what you've said. Now, in your primary school days, you said that you did feel as though you fitted in quite well and that you felt included. And was there a moment, maybe playing in one of those games that you described, that really sort of captures your sense of feeling included and belonging?
So the only time when I really properly felt included, so to speak, was before everyone started going off into their own groups, when I could still put myself forward or volunteer for a particular game which was being played, where everyone said, yeah, obviously you can get involved with us. It's like, yeah, and this is going to be your role, and whatever it may be. That was no longer the case. It was after a while, it became a case of, can I get involved? The answer was no. And so that's why I had to look for friends elsewhere who had similar interests to myself. And I think that's quite important to emphasize. I think the reason also why you separate into your groups is because your interests start diverging and you start gaining different interests. And so, as I said, there were not many out there who had a real interest in history, sketching, and potentially locomotives, dare I say.
Were these friends that you made outside of school, which you had more in common with, or were they all in school?
They were all in school, as school was the main repository for friendship, as far as I was concerned. I didn't have that many friends outside of school, so I had some neighbors with whom I was friendly with. But yeah, my main sort of source of friendship was indeed school, which of course, so to speak, reduced the pool of potential talent as far as friendship was concerned.
Yeah. So looking back, now that you obviously know all you know and you've had your diagnosis as being on the autistic spectrum, how would you say that retrospectively being on the autistic spectrum shaped those friendships?
So I think it was the fact that I was prepared to go out there and properly be me, and I had no problems of being me. I'm sure there were quite a few of my contemporaries at the time who were actually had maybe interests which were very different to football, for example, or to other sports or to other interests when it came to, I don't know, favorite programs they used to watch on TV and things like that. But because they wanted to fit in, they were prepared to compromise on those interests that they had, which were not of the quote unquote norm. But when looking back, I wouldn't have done anything differently, because I think there's something to be said about me being me and you doing you. And that's ultimately, if that makes you happy, as long as it's not impacting someone else negatively, then why shouldn't you go out there and do what you want to do in life and pursue the interests and passions that you have?
Absolutely. And you're talking about passions and interests. Do you think that there's something from your school, any neuro-inclusive support, that in retrospect might have made a difference for you and would make a difference today for children who are going through these similar sorts of things?
I think one thing that could have helped would have been putting those who have got similar interests and unique interests all together and not separating them out based on age. I would have really welcomed if I had got to know others properly who were in other age brackets, but who had similar interests to myself, because then that would have formed a critical mass of, say, historians or young sketchers and artists, so maybe future artists, so to speak, because of course the two friends that I had, they were both in my year, and it would have been nice to have known that there were others out there who'd shared similar interests to myself. So if that could have been done, if that could have been facilitated across age groups, that would have been something quite positive.
Yeah, I think that's the thing particularly about primary school is certainly in big primary schools, kids are very much siloed or put in their own silo with their age brackets. And so, I think that's one of the things that we can sort of take away from this in a sense of having children who have these diverse interests, not being separated out by their ages, because then you stimulate each other in various different ways.
Absolutely. And I think we need to find a way of ensuring that everyone who has a particular interest, which usually means they have a particular talent, okay, because usually interests and talents are quite linked, that we ensure that we encourage those interests and talents that they may have. And the way of doing that is by putting them all together and properly sort of making them feel like you're not alone in your interests. There's nothing strange about the interests that you have. And I think we need to build on those interests, because who knows where it can lead all of you. It doesn't mean you're all going to, in my case, you'll all be historians or linguists or artists or famous sketchers. But I think it could lead you all onto very interesting paths in as far as your future life trajectories are concerned.
And that goes back to the heart of what we're all about in this podcast, and that's neuro-inclusion. And I think that's a fantastic point on which to end until we have our next episode. So if this resonates with you, subscribe to the Neuropod on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's the Neuropod, all one word. Or catch up on our exclusive clips on YouTube. Continue to follow our Neuro Odyssey from Liverpool to platform 9 3/4 and beyond, and share our podcast to spread neurodivergent positivity.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And as I would always say and always encourage, let's keep flying like Maverik. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.